So over the last 7 years of researching and writing about Buddhism in US prisons, I've noticed that two common reactions dominate whenever I talk about my work. The first is surprised. Do Buddhists exist in US prisons? Surely there's not enough information or material to write an entire dissertation. The second response is hopeful. Can Buddhism rehabilitate people in prison, helping them calm their anger and become less aggressive? The latter question emerges in conversations with old friends, in the Q&A of a conference talk, and also in studies in the medical, behavioral, and social sciences. As for the first question, this one is easy. Yes, there are Buddhists in US prisons, and while the exact number of Buddhists in US prisons is unknown, at least hundreds and likely thousands of people practice Buddhism in prisons all across the US, including in maximum security, minimum security, and medical prisons. Within the last 3 decades, non-incarcerated Buddhist leaders and lay teachers have regularly ministered to people in prisons in at least 44 states. Meanwhile, incarcerated people across the country also form their own Buddhist temples, study groups, and meditation groups. In 2003, the Prison Dharma Network founder, Fleet Mall, described how at the turn of the 21st century, there were at least 150 groups in US prisons and jails that were supported by outside Buddhist volunteers and many other groups without this external support. In many cases, these groups include dozens of participants. As for the second question, many Buddhist leaders who teach in US prisons celebrate the success of their programs by answering this question in the affirmative, often asserting that Buddhist practices and teachings benefit incarcerated people and thus society by teaching them to let go of one presumably negative self and to embrace a new, better one, even resulting in reduced recidivism rates. As they promote this reformist narrative, they also praise their incarcerated students as rare individuals who have undergone remarkable transformations from so-called angry prisoners into calm and compassionate Buddhas who have not only risen out of what one program leader called a worthless existence, but also serve as models for others who retain this supposedly lowly state. Buddhist leader Hogen Fujimoto stresses this point when he refers to Buddhists in prison as rare lotus blossoms that emerge from the mud of the 3 poisons of greed, anger, and delusion through sincere and individual will alone. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip a couple of slides. But this narrative is not only repeated among Buddhist leaders, including in manuals for Buddhist practice in US prisons, such as Kobai Scott Whitney's Sitting Inside, but also in news outlets, in documentaries like the Dhamma Brothers, and by celebrities, including Oprah, as well as in studies in criminology, public health, and psychology, all of which amplify these discourses, circulating them around the world. Yet the reformist narrative is not the entire story. Despite its popularity, both responses to the topic of Buddhism in US prisons rely on and reinforce an assumed dichotomy between the figure of the prisoner and the figure of the Buddhist. The prisoner is supposedly angry, violent, and dangerous, whereas the Buddhist is peaceful, generous, and safe. The prisoner, supposedly, exists behind bars and must be introduced to Buddhism by the Buddhist, who compassionately brings the teachings in from the outside world. The Buddhist prisoner, thus, must either not exist or be an exceptional, peaceful, and reformed individual. Yet the dominance of this reformist narrative obscures a lot about Buddhism in US prisons, including the diversity of Buddhism, the structural violence of the US carceral state, and the ways people in prisons create Buddhism collectively and in community. Firstly, this reformist narrative reduces the diversity within Buddhism to its capacity as a tool for behavioral change and individual reform. As I argue in my dissertation, but for the sake of time, will not discuss in detail today, these narratives, which rely on prevailing American stereotypes about Buddhism as intrinsically peaceful, not only set up a dichotomy between the figures of the criminal and the Buddhist, but also often gain popularity through racializing assumptions embedded in each category, including racializing incarcerated Buddhists as the Orientalized figure Jane Iwamura calls the Oriental monk icon. Yet Buddhism is a multifaceted tradition, made and remade across time and space as people with different backgrounds and different social positions and different agendas interact. In the US today, the most popular understanding of Buddhism is Buddhist modernism, which has been shaped by classical Buddhist texts and concepts as much as by European Enlightenment ideals of individualism, introspection, and the notion of a rational agent of human subject. This is a Buddhism that has been co-created by, for example, white Orientalists in the 19th century, Japanese Buddhist migrants at the turn of the 20th century who were refusing Christian proselytization, and people of all different ethnic and racial identities today. The second thing that this discourse misses, though, is that these dominant narratives represent incarcerated people as transformable objects rather than the co-creators of their traditions that they are, concealing the richness of their stories about making Buddhist material culture, ritual space, and community inside. For example, incarcerated Buddhists in the US create Buddhism by fighting legal battles for the right to form meditation groups and perform rituals, making incense out of deodorant and parchment paper when it's banned, and designing and physically constructing a pagoda on the prison's grounds, as you can see in the last photo on this slide. The reformist narrative, moreover, focuses on individuals, failing to capture how incarcerated people engage in Buddhism making collectively, forming intimate relationships and supportive communities in the process, and disrupting carceral logics, including those of isolation, hypermasculinity, and a culture of anxiety. Third, these repeated calls for personal transformation do not reflect the nuance with which Buddhists in prison write about the violence of incarceration. Even incarcerated Buddhists like Jarvis J. Masters, who describes Buddhism as a way of finding freedom inside, also rejoices in others' releases from physical prisons of the US carceral state and fights for his own physical prison. Like Masters, incarcerated Buddhists across the US also seek freedom from the medical neglect that characterizes life inside, the racial injustice that conditions millions of arrests and convictions, and the criminal label that follows those lucky enough to be released into the outside world. So, what can be done? Sorry. For one, we can follow the lead of incarcerated people and pay attention to their stories. To be clear, as fellow members of a society in which such carceral scripts of reform and rehabilitation were foundational to the earliest prisons, incarcerated people too draw on these narratives. Yet their stories are never just reformist narratives. My point is that if transformation is the primary lens through which non-incarcerated people understand Buddhism and Buddhists in prison, then we risk reducing complex people to transformable objects, to flattening the diversity within not only prison Buddhism, but American Buddhism and Buddhism period, and erasing the possibility of a future in which the prison is not widely accepted as a necessary, natural, and static feature of American society. Thank you.